Hey, it's Remy again from Random Street Medic. Today we're going to be talking tourniquets and bleeding. Now, first and foremost, one of the things I want to talk about with tourniquets is you should really only be using tourniquets that you put your hands on, that you've trained on, that you're comfortable with. Don't use something that you've never used before. The time to learn is not when you're putting it on another person and not when you're putting it on yourself. With that in mind, the tourniquets that I tend to use are like the cat. You can get these for about $20 online. I don't recommend buying them for any less just because you might get one of those cheap knockoff versions. It might work or it might fail you in a critical moment. And when I say fail, they usually fail spectacularly. So like a buckle will break, the nylon snaps, the windlass breaks in half. There's a bunch of different videos online of what happens during these failures. The other one that I tend to use is just a cravat. These cost almost nothing, and you can stuff them, like a dozen of them in your bag, and it doesn't really take up space. These you can put in little containers and stick them in your pocket. You can stick them on the outside of one of your rigs. You can tie them down to pretty much anything. There are other ones out there. There's the SWAT tourniquet, which is like this big rubber band that has a bunch of square notches on it and tells you how far to stretch it. All these are good. All of them work. The Israeli bandage works. Yeah, so I'm not going to talk about all the different ones, but I'm going to talk a little bit about bleeding. So the human body has, I think it's 5.5 liters or 5.5 pints. I don't remember exactly because it's just not fresh in my head at this moment in time. But so once you bleed out to a certain point, your body is unable to maintain its functions. And the basic function of blood is to carry things. It carries oxygen throughout your body for your muscles to use, as well as your brain and neural tissue. It carries glucose and sugar, or glucose is sugar. It carries various nutrients like calcium, magnesium, potassium, so that way your muscles can move. And your heart can beat, and your nerves can fire signals up and down using sodium. It also carries carbon dioxide and acid out of your blood into your respiration so you can breathe, or into your kidneys so you can urinate it out. But the important thing is blood itself is an organ, and once you start running out of that organ, you start getting into other types of organ failure, shock, and death. We've seen this in, different movies, where like they're saying, oh, they're going to shock, or TV shows. Some of us have seen this, unfortunately, in real life. So the way blood moves around the body is the heart pumps through the left ventricle. It goes out into the aorta, through a bunch of arteries, and into various tissues around the body, and then it comes back through veins. Venous bleeding, while it can be significant, is a lot easier to control. It doesn't take a lot of pressure, but it takes some. The more dangerous kind of bleeding is arterial, because that's a high pressure. It's a high pressure tube. So when you sever an artery on average has roughly 120 millimeters of mercury of pressure within it. And that doesn't sound like a lot, because 120 millimeters of mercury is roughly about 2.5-ish pounds per square inch. But you have to remember, this isn't a square inch. This is actually a really tiny tube, so that pressure goes up quite significantly, and you're not putting 2.5 pounds of pressure on the artery. You're actually putting multiple pounds of pressure on the tissue surrounding an artery, hoping to collapse it down to nothing. And generally that takes about anywhere between 100 and 140 pounds of force. If anybody has ever squeezed 140 pounds of force, they can tell you exactly how hard that is. So let's talk about what tourniquets do. So I have my handy dandy monitor here. And so I'm going to put this thing on called pulse ox. Now what this pulse ox does, it measures the heartbeat by blood flow through your finger or whatever extremity. And you're going to see in a second, after it's done searching, if it works. Oh, there we go. So my heart rate's a little high, it's 107. But you see my oxygenation rate here, and you see a pretty good waveform. It's pretty even and pretty regular. So this is a blood pressure cuff. Blood pressure cuff pretty much is a tourniquet to a point. And you're going to see what happens to my finger once I start hitting this button. So don't mind me, my blood pressure might be a little high. So I've got to wait for it to kick in. It's starting to squeeze. So you're going to see this number start climbing up, and eventually what you're going to see is you're going to see that little wave, or a waveform, or the pleth wave, start getting shorter and shorter and shorter until it eventually goes away. Yep, and it's gone. So what you're seeing now is my arm is pretty much has a tourniquet applied to it, and it's going to stay that way until that waveform comes back. Now, the goal of having a tourniquet on is the waveform is not supposed to come back, so you're not supposed to get a pulse back to the hand or back to the leg or foot or whatever you're putting a tourniquet on. So in my case, it took, I'm going to guess, about 140 millimeters of mercury to actually, took about 146 millimeters of mercury to stop my blood pressure. I'm sorry, stop my pulse. And when I say that, this is saying that it's 146 millimeters of mercury inside my artery every time the heart beats. Now, what does that mean? That means that every time the heart beats, it's putting out that much pressure. And that's the amount of pressure that you need to collapse that blood vessel. But the thing is, you can't get access to that without, stabbing somebody or cutting somebody's arm or leg or wherever you're putting the tourniquet. So you have to restrict the entire limb in order to get to the vessel, so that means you got to put a lot of force down. So the way to do this without a tourniquet, I recommend, so if it's a leg or if it's an arm, you can take a knee or an elbow and just drop it right above the site of the injury along what we call pulse points. They're kind of hard to find if you don't know where to look, but if you know vasculature going from like the femoral arteries down or going from the brachial artery out, you just place a knee above the injury site to help stop bleeding. To do it with a tourniquet, so say I have an injury right here, you're going to want to take one of these. Now, if it's not packaged, you're going to slide it through this little buckle, and you're going to cinch it down all the way, and you're going to twist this windlass. I'm not going to tourniquet myself, but you're going to twist that until they stop bleeding or until you lose a pulse. If you can't, you can add another tourniquet above that. Now you can do it on the forearm, you can do it on the upper arm, you can do it on the upper leg, you can do it on the lower leg, but the whole idea is you want to put it above the site of the injury. So you roughly about, maybe 2 or 3 inches above that site of the injury. And there's nothing that says you can't add another tourniquet on there. I see a lot of people who just they go, oh, the tourniquet didn't work. No, you can add another tourniquet onto it above it. So you can have 2 tourniquets on a limb, 3 if you have to. The other thing I recommend you doing is you're going to write down what time you put the tourniquet on. Now, on these ones specifically, you're going to take this after you're done turning it, and you're going to lock it into the little bends here, or the forks, and just slide that closed. If you don't have this part, you can just use tape. You can put anything on it. It's not really going to come off unless you start really jostling it around. Now, say you don't have that, or you don't have the SWAT tourniquet, you don't have the Israeli bandage, but you do have a cravat. What you can do is you take this cravat, and you're going to want to just kind of fold it into a band. Now I'm just going to roll it. But you want that band to be kind of wide. You don't want it to be really thin because that's going to cut into the tissue. So same deal. You're going to tie a square knot above the site of the injury. So 1 and 2. And then you're going to want a windlass. Now I'm going to use a pen. Don't use a pen. This is plastic. They break. Use a screwdriver, a bolt. Something that's not sharp and going to cut this, but you're going to stick it into here, like so. Let's see if you can see it. So you can stick it into here, see it, all right, and you're going to give it a twist. And you're going to twist up until, it's pinching me a little bit, there we go. And you're going to twist up until the bleeding stops, or you lose the pulse in either the radial pulse, which is right here, or an ulnar pulse, which generally is somewhere back here. But the point is you want to stop or reduce the blood flow to the injury site to reduce the amount of blood coming out of the person, or reduce their likelihood of exsanguination or bleeding out. So that's the point of the tourniquet. Now, in order to finish this, you're going to take one of these bands and you're just going to, tie it off somewhere. So you're going to tie it to itself on that side, and you're going to tie it to itself on this side using these. You can do it with a granny knot, whatever Boy Scout nonsense that you learned. Doesn't matter as long as it's secured in place. So that's how you make a tourniquet, either through a cravat or using the cat. If you're using the SWAT tourniquet, it looks like a giant rubber band. There's these rectangular hash marks. Basically, just pull it until those hash marks are square, and then wrap it. The Israeli bandage, same deal. You just follow the directions on your packaging, and so you put it in, and you just pull it through. There's the plastic forks. You just pull it through that fork, pull it tight, pull it through that fork, pull it tight, and you just keep going until you hit a point where the bleeding stops, or you finish wrapping, it doesn't stop, and you just take a windlass and you stick it in there. Again, using a solid object, not like a plastic pen, and you just stick it in there, and you give it a good twist 1 or 2 times, and then you just tie it off, and that should do it. So once again, this is Remy from Random Street Medic, and good luck.